I welcome all presenters, participants, and audience, and especially our keynote speaker, Professor Harsha Rambukwella from Sri Lanka. Um, I'll just briefly talk a little bit about the Rising Asia Foundation and the Rising Asia Journal, which started about a year ago. And we have produced 3 issues of the Rising Asia Journal so far. And we've held 2 academic conferences so far, this being the second one. So we are encouraging scholarly exchanges. We aim to conduct deeper scholarly publication through our journal and also by publishing books on our conference proceedings in international publishers. So the proceedings of the current conference are also, we aim to publish with an important international publisher. Our focus is also on donating funds to support graduate students and undergraduate students through their university years, and also to other purposes which are yet to be determined, what other forms of charity we will be engaging in. This conference is the idea of Professor Julie Mehta, who actually coined the title of the conference, Globe of Fear, which has so much resonance and resemblance to the current world we live in. Julie had very aptly taught the single author course on Michael Ondaatje at the Scarborough campus of the University of Toronto. So she has been very familiar with Michael Ondaatje's work, and she has been instrumental in arranging this entire conference. I also thank Dr. Cynthia Van den Dryzen's help in also helping organize the conference. So with that, I then move on to Julie. So Julie Banerjee Mehta, who is going to be the chair of the conference today, she holds an MA and PhD degrees in English Literature and South Asian Studies from the University of Toronto. Her master's thesis, being Gaijin and being female in the Sakuku culture of Japan, explores Japanese works by Meera Chand, the novelist Kazuo Ishiguro, and the writer Pico Iyer. Julie was born in Calcutta and educated at Irish Convent, Loreto House and Loreto College, and then at Jadavpur University in Calcutta, where she got her first MA in English Literature. She's a specialist in post-colonial and world literatures, and she conceptualized and taught the Chancellor Emerita Vivian Poy endowed course in Asian literatures and cultures in Asia for nearly a decade in the Canadian Studies program in the Department of English at the University of Toronto, and received several prestigious fellowships. Her translation of Tagore's play Dak Ghar Post Office was performed by the Pleiades Theatre Company in Toronto in 2010 to critical acclaim, which earned her the title of one of the 16 most influential South Asians in Canada. She is the author of a number of publications such as Dance of Life, The Mythology, History and Politics of Cambodian Culture, and the best-selling biography of Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen, and she has written extensively in journal articles, a couple of which are Toronto's Multicultural Tongues, Stories of Asian Cuisines in Edible Histories, published by the University of Toronto Press, and many, many others. So with that, I would welcome Julie to deliver her opening remarks.
Today is a celebration, a discursive continuum of an uncommon writer, one of the finest living storytellers who touches the wounds of those buried emotions that reside deep in the recesses of the reader's mind. A few days ago, on the 12th of September, Philip Michael Ondaatje turned 78. I first read him nearly 25 years ago in our childhood home in Calcutta with my father, with whom I discovered Ondachi, and then on my summer breaks from teaching at the University of Toronto. Today, I recall my mentor and doctoral thesis supervisor, the late Professor Chelva Kanaganayakam, who guided me through the choppy waters of the Sri Lankan conflict, aided in my understanding of Ondaatje's writings at the University of Toronto. I also remember today, with glee, Professor Sam Sulecki's excellent book, Ragas of Longing, a Bible to Ondaatje's poetry, a mentor, an exemplary scholar, and a friend. At the University of Toronto, I taught Ondaatje's works at regular courses and a full-year course on all his fiction. That was between 2007 and 2012. Years of great battles and unrest in Sri Lanka, which spilled over to diasporic populations of Sri Lankans in Canada. My classroom at University of Toronto often became the location of diasporic Tamil and Sinhalese student contestations. On a personal level, over 2 decades and more, a unique bond was forged through his works between the writer, my father, and I. An intimacy developed with his works that connected me to the gaping hollows that filled Ondaatje's heart, a hollow he tried to explore in the powerful presence of his absent father, the brilliant Mervyn Ondaatje, who was an incurable alcoholic. In his many pieces of fiction and scores of poems, the reader is riveted by his voice. He speaks softly sometimes and with rage and pain in others about the father he never met since he left Sri Lanka when he was just 11 years old, after his parents' divorce, when Michael Ondaatje was hardly 5 years old. In The Skin of a Lion, in Anil's Ghost, in The English Patient, and Divisadero, Sigmund Freud's absent father from Family Romance finds praxis expressing the child's longing for the happy vanished days when his father seemed to him the noblest and strongest of men. He's turning away from the father of today to the father he believed in his early years of childhood. And his fantasy is no more than an expression of regret that the happy years have gone. That was Freud. Now for Ondaatje, and I quote, "All great fiction is about families," he said to Liz Calder in an interview some years ago. "It is also about families we make," he said. "For some of us, this conference is a kind of Thanksgiving for a prodigious writer with a unique compassion and intelligence. One who is a visionary, who awakens a private conscience and a communal concern about ethics and politics. For the 2 decades that I have taught his works, it has been a learning experience with the feedback from students. Ondaatje is one of the sharpest knives in the drawer. And though he is not the obvious activist who wears his activism on his sleeve, there is an enormity in the ontology of his abhorrence for war or overwrought nationalism. In Anil's Ghost, he says, and I quote, "This is when he stopped believing in man's rule on earth. He turned away from every person who stood up for a war, or the principle of one's land, or the pride of ownership, or even personal rights. All of these motives ended up somehow in the arms of careless power. One was no worse, no better than the enemy." In another avatar, the persuasive and perhaps the most seductive of his works, The English Patient, Ondaatje states very simply, and I quote, We die containing a richness of lovers and tribes, tastes we have swallowed, bodies we have swum into. I wish for all this to be marked on my body when I am dead. I believe in that kind of cartography, to be marked by nature, not just to label ourselves on a map like the names of rich women and men on buildings. We are communal histories, communal books. We are not owned or monogamous in our taste or experience. Close quotes. Here is a writer who treats his reader with enormous respect. And I quote again, "The reader should be left to figure it out," he has often maintained, resurrecting Roland Barthes' idea of the death of the author with the birth of the reader in a rather nice kind of way. I think a speaker of ours later in the day, Raka Mukherjee, will be talking about this very astute and appropriate theory that he brings into praxis in his works, that with the death of the author, there is the birth of the reader. Ondaatje's greatest contribution is how deeply he has illumined our understanding of the human condition, perhaps like no other. This conference took seed in an early morning dream, soon after my father died. I had been reading Letters and Other Worlds, a poem from Rat Jelly, 63 to 78, and his words, and I quote, "My father's body was a globe of fear. His body was a town we never knew. He came to death with his mind drowning. On the last day, he enclosed himself in a room with 2 bottles of gin. Later, fell the length of his body so that brain blood moved to new compartments that never knew the wash of fluid, and he died in minutes of a new equilibrium." The words sang like a persistent tune in my head for nearly 9 years. Years later, as I proposed this conference for Rising Asia Journal and Foundation on Ondachi to Harish, the father he never met since 11, and the fatherland which he had lost, haunted me. In an aha moment, the title of the conference, Ondaatje's Multitudinous Resurrections, prismatic polyphonies emerged as refractions. I'm looking greatly forward to how some of you in your reflections on Ondaatje will configure this root thought of the conference in your title. Last, I must register gratitude to all the presenters who are on board. This conference has come with an embarrassment of riches in the form of old scholar friends and new ones, such as our keynote speaker today, Professor Harsha Rambukwella. Also my delight at the first-class master's degree holders who are participants in this conference, who gifted me some very rich insights while we explored the English patient together in Loreto College in class, my first alma mater. With that, we get into the heart of the matter, and back to you, Dr. Harish Mehta.
Thank you, Julie, for those very stirring voices and from your evocation of the author Michael Ondaatje's poetic words really resonates, and the globe of fear really is something we ought to think about within Ondaatje and I think beyond, because the world seems to reverberate in the whole idea of globes of fear. So with that, I thank you, Julie, and I shall now proceed to welcome our keynote lecturer, Professor Harsha Rambukwella from Sri Lanka. He is the director of the Postgraduate Institute of English at the Open University of Sri Lanka. Professor Harsha Rambukwella has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, and he was also the Sri Lanka chair at the South Asia Institute at the University of Heidelberg in Germany in 2019. His book, entitled The Politics and Poetics of Authenticity, a cultural genealogy of Sinhala nationalism, was published by the University College London Press in 2018. He is a trustee of the Gratian Trust, which awards the Gratian Prize for Sri Lankan writing in English. He has also served on the juries of the National Swarna Pustaka Awards for the Sinhala novel, the National Fairway Literature Awards, and the State Literary Prize. Harsha has published in areas ranging from sociolinguistics, literary and cultural studies, to history in journals such as Boundary 2, Journal of Asian Studies, and the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. Today, Professor Harshana's lecture is entitled Sri Lanka, Michael Ondaatje, and Literary Cosmopolitanism. Very briefly, the talk explores the notion of literary cosmopolitanism as a means of thinking and feeling beyond the frames of reference conditioned by the ideas of nation and nationalism. So with those brief comments, I very warmly extend a welcome to Harsha to come forth and please deliver his keynote lecture.
First of all, thank you very much to both Harish and Julie for inviting me to deliver this keynote address today, and also for forging this connection between the Rising Asia Foundation and the Rising Asia Journal and Sri Lankan Scholar. So I think it's important that these kinds of regional collaborations happen as well. And thank you also to Cynthia Van Driesen from Australia for making the initial connection. I'm very pleased to be here today and to be addressing you all from Colombo here in Sri Lanka. So I do have a scripted speech, but my usual style of delivery is I tend to do a little bit from the script, but then also kind of digress a little bit. So I hope that format will be okay with all the members of the audience. When Michael Ondaatje set up the Gratian Trust in Sri Lanka, which awards the Gratian Prize for English Writing in 1992, that's when it was established. And he did that with the prize money that he won for the Booker Prize in the same year. Ondaatje made a very poignant and very powerful observation in the first speech he made at the prize giving. To quote Ondaatje, "Nothing is as exciting for us as to find our place, our own stories in a book. When that happens, the self is doubled. We are no longer invisible." End quote. This is a particularly poignant and powerful statement from an internationally recognized literary giant. Though domiciled in Canada and considered a Canadian writer, this statement marks a public acknowledgement by Ondaatje that he continues to effectively identify with Sri Lanka. The use of the pronoun our is particularly telling. Right? He obviously identifies or continues to identify with the Sri Lankan identity. Ondaatje, while establishing the Gratian Trust in honor of his mother, her name was Doris Gratian, and thereby making a tangible and concrete contribution to the upliftment of English literary writing in Sri Lanka, is also symbolically claiming belonging to the territory, to the country that he left as a teenager, but in a sense keeps returning to imaginatively and figuratively in his writing. And I think this is, of course, a trope that you see with many emigre writers, many migrant writers, and Ondaatje, in a way, is following that same trajectory. It is also a powerfully symbolic moment in the sense that Ondaatje lent his brand, and I'm sort of hesitant to invoke this kind of sort of marketing terminology, which is very utilitarian in relation to something like literature and in relation to someone like Ondaatje, but in a way that is also a reality. So he lent his brand to the Gratian Prize, which I take as a gesture of intellectual and creative generosity, and thereby provided a certain kind of gravitas and literary legitimacy to the prize that has empowered it for the last quarter of a century. So the fact that the Gratian Prize is associated with Ondaatje's literary legacy carries enormous weight in Sri Lanka, as you can imagine. There are other literary prizes for English writing in Sri Lanka, but none as prestigious as the Gratian Prize, and that prestige derives from Ondaatje. And that in turn has inspired many generations of writers, Sri Lankan writers, to seek the kind of international literary recognition that Ondaatje achieved. And I'm happy to say that at least a few Sri Lankans have made that cut. Most notably, in 2010, Shehan Karunatilaka, for his wonderfully satiric novel Chinaman, the Legend of Pradeep Matthew, which won the Commonwealth Prize, as well as the DSE Prize for Literature, which is awarded in India. And then there's people like Carl Muller, Jean Arzenagam, many of whom, of course, Jean and Carl were both established long before the Gratian Prize came along, but they also benefited from the existence of this prize. And of course, most recently, we are very proud to note that Anup Karud Pragasan's book has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize this time. But to go back to Ondaatje and the idea of literary cosmopolitanism, so what interests me in the statement that I quoted from Ondaatje is the sense of what I would like to call literary cosmopolitanism that it invokes. It is a statement that emerges from a rich sense of cultural cosmopolitanism that is at home in the world. Here is a celebrated Canadian writer, a migrant writer, recognized and feted by the international literary establishment, rooting for a local literature, a minor literature that is insignificant on the global scale. And I mean, Sri Lankan writing in English is very, very small, even if you take it, if you compare it, for instance, to Indian Anglophone writing, Sri Lankan writing, both in terms of volume and perhaps in terms of the substance that it has produced, is a minor literature. Talking about Ondaatje's imagination that has left ontological realities, Canada, and in a sense, the world, but now returns and makes an invitation to the national consciousness to inhabit the same broader world that Ondaatje, the global citizen, has experienced. So in that quote, what I see is not a kind of narrow nationalist pride that Sri Lankan literature has gone abroad or Sri Lankan literature has become international. It is in a sense an invitation to those within Sri Lanka, to those who inhabit the Sri Lankan consciousness, to also think of inhabiting a broader world. This is how I like to read it. Perhaps it's not the way Ondaatje intended it, but it's the way I like to read it and I like to interpret it. It seems to me that there are multiple ways of reading Ondaatje's statement. From a parochial nationalist consciousness, it could mean vindication, a chance to exclaim and say, see, the world recognizes us, we are important. And we know, coming from post-colonial societies, that this sense of international recognition is very important for us. I mean, when one of our teams win an international game, cricket or something else, or when one of our athletes does well in an Olympic competition or something, we are naturally proud. And that has to do with our history of colonial subjugation, and in a way that painful memory of what colonialism in a way robbed from our societies. And in some ways, the post-colonial nationalism and the post-colonial consciousness is trapped in a particular kind of dilemma of seeking worldly attention, seeking worldly validation in a way. Sometimes that is through our own past. We turn to our past and say, look, while Europe was languishing, we had glorious civilizations in these countries. So it's or in the contemporary moment, when we have these minor moments at which we achieve some kind of global significance. Because, and I will come to this, for instance, Sri Lanka's notoriety in the world is not actually for achievements, but as a place that has seen a tremendous amount of post-colonial violence, a society that is in a way, in some ways, inherently violent. We have been moving from one violent conflict to another, and in a way, our international recognition, if you can call it that, or infamy, if you like, is based on that. So obviously, for people who are very sensitive to this, to see one of your own out there making it internationally is a big deal. I think, I mean, this is a complete digression, but right now I think there's this pop song that has also taken, a Sri Lankan pop song that has sort of really taken off globally and has gone viral. Many Indian celebrities have sort of endorsed it, including Amitabh Bachchan and Priyanka Chopra, I think. And it has now gone truly global, and an Indian record label has just signed up this young girl. And again, you see that sense, that entire discourse of oh wow, something Sri Lankan has gone abroad, and what a moment, we should celebrate this. So, but turning away from that kind of nationalist framing, from a more enlightened cosmopolitan position, it could also be read as an invitation that says, this is Ondaatje's quote, "Here is the world." I'm referring to Ondaatje's quote. "Here is the world. Come take your place in it and add to its richness." That is the way I like to read it. Rather than us making it internationally, it is an invitation to us to join a larger, broader world beyond the frames of the nation. Of course, I realize that I'm talking here in somewhat adulatory terms of a certain kind of cosmopolitanism. And in today's sort of globalized neoliberal world, one's access to that kind of cosmopolitan network is often overdetermined by one's own socioeconomic status and where you live. For instance, the passport that you carry when you pass through certain airports, and I'm a Sri Lankan passport holder who has experienced this in many parts of the world, painfully reminds you of who you are. The way you are questioned, the way you are looked at with suspicion, etc. So cosmopolitanism in that sense, in that very material sense, is a luxury that is not available to everyone, right? And even within our own societies, the ones who are cosmopolitan are the ones who come from affluent socio-cultural backgrounds often. But of course, that is the material aspect of socio-cultural sort of cosmopolitanism. One's imagination does not need to be circumscribed in that way, and that is something that I will try to speak to in the rest of this speech. So I will return to this more critical theme about cosmopolitanism later in my talk, but at the outset I would like to reflect on how Ondaatje's comments and his literary practice in general invites us to think and feel beyond the nation. And when I use this quote, "think and feel beyond the nation," I'm specifically invoking a theoretical contribution to the literature of cosmopolitanism by Feng Chia and Bruce Robbins. They edited a volume called "Thinking and Feeling Beyond the Nation." Cosmopolitics, Thinking and Feeling Beyond the Nation, which was in honor of the work of Benedict Anderson, perhaps one of the greatest theorists of nationalism in the 20th century. And there they reflect on the ways in which the sense of nation inhibits the kind of political and cultural imaginations that we can have. And there's a rich range of chapters or contributions in that book. So when I use that term, I use it also in a theoretical way, though I don't get into the theorization that much here in this talk. So if you think of one single social and ontological reality that has impacted human life more than any other, from the late 19th to the 20th, extending into the 21st centuries, it is that of the nation and nationalism. And since the topic of this conference invokes the notion of fatherland, a term for the nation that has a particularly gendered and loaded genealogy, particularly in relation to the kinds of violent patriotism it has inspired. The notion of fatherland, you are immediately reminded of the Second World War, Germany, and Nazi National Socialism in a way. So there are very dark aspects to it, but of course there is a much more positive side to it as well. So situating Ondaatje's work and his literary legacy in relation to the nation, therefore, I believe will be of intellectual and critical relevance. As you can see, I am locating an imagination bounded by the nation and one shaped by a sense of cosmopolitanism as oppositional, but also intimately interconnected. So I would like for us to think about the nation and cosmopolitanism as two ends of a continuum, right? But not necessarily polar opposites, because as I will show you, throughout the talk, a cosmopolitan imagination cannot exist in the absence of a national imagination. So a cosmopolitan imagination feeds off a national imagination. And you cannot forget the nation and talk about cosmopolitanism. By doing so, you will be, I think, both politically, creatively, and imaginatively undermining your own position. I will try to demonstrate that in the rest of the talk. So now, Ondaatje's use of the term "our," and if you remember, if you go back to that quote, our sense of self is double. That's what he says. So Ondaatje's use of the term "our" and the sense of cultural cosmopolitanism it invokes, I would argue, stands in stark contrast to the nature and worldview of the dominant social, political, and cultural discourses that have shaped post-independence Sri Lanka. For most of its 70-year history, 70 years history of post-independence political history, Sri Lanka has been gripped by parochial culture wars. The dominant Sinhala and Buddhist cultural nationalism that emerged as a strident political force in the country in the 1950s has in turn produced oppositional discourse such as Tamil nationalism, which have in many ways replicated the majoritarian and parochial logic of Sinhala nationalism. And in a way, this is the tragedy of the national conflict, because rather than one form of oppressive nationalism, that is Sinhala and Buddhist nationalism, producing a more ethical alternative, unfortunately, the Tamil response to that has been equally, in a way, majoritarian. Though it is from a minority community, its imagination is majoritarian in a way, because it excludes other minorities and their right to their own self-determination within Sri Lanka. So the prime example being the Muslim community in Sri Lanka. The Muslims in Sri Lanka are both a religion as well as an ethnic identity. It's unlike in India, you identify as an ethnicity when you say you're Muslim. And Tamil nationalism has historically had a problem with Muslim identity. So the problem there then is that Sinhala nationalism was very exclusionary, violent, and in a way marginalized other communities. Tamil nationalism makes its demand on the basis of that exclusion, saying, look, we are also part of this nation, give us our space. But in trying to make that claim, they also exclude other minorities. And in a way, this is similar to how what has happened in Israel. With the establishment of the Israeli state, you have the minoritization of the Palestinians happening concomitantly. And, one of the big names of post-colonial studies, Edward Said, consistently, brought up this issue, and that made him an extremely unpopular man and unpopular public intellectual in America, because the Jewish lobby always resisted him. And he was called, I think at one point, he was even called the Professor of Terror. Right? These have predominantly been discourses of exclusion, Sinhala and Tamil nationalism, and have provided very little space for, just give me a second to scroll down, very little space for creative or innovative alternative imaginaries to emerge. Alternative imaginaries that think of ways of ethical belonging, not on the basis of how long you have been in this place or you are the numerical majority, but in a way recognizing the common humanity of people and basing one's membership in the national community on such an ethical ground. But that has unfortunately not happened. The literal and symbolic violence of nationalism and its consequences in Sri Lanka and the South Asian region are well known. And I think in India also we have seen similar kinds of majoritarian issues arising, right throughout its independent history. And the polarization this conflict has generated remains one of the major fault lines along which Sri Lankan society remains trapped. So even to this day, right now the UNHCR sessions are happening, and Sri Lanka's human rights track record is being very critically scrutinized. So from this perspective, when one reads Ondaatje's, so I'm now shifting to actual Ondaatje's fiction. I'm only going to look at two works of Ondaatje here. I think there are better Ondaatje scholars than me here. But my familiarity with Ondaatje's fiction is somewhat limited. But I can... Perhaps what I do bring into the conversation is a very sort of deep knowledge of Sri Lankan politics and culture and how to situate the reading of Ondaatje within that. So from this perspective, when one reads Ondaatje's Running in the Family, a fictional memoir, in which Ondaatje charts a strained and difficult homecoming to recover and reconcile with a tumultuous past, you see a very different kind of Sri Lanka imagined. And for me, that is the value of the book as a Sri Lankan reader. While the text is intensely personal and quasi-biographical, it is also allegorical. Ondaatje's dysfunctional parents and the riotous extended family that the text chronicles evokes a Sri Lanka that is radically different to the kind of national culture that was being disseminated within mainstream Sinhala cultural production and has gained hegemonic status in Sri Lanka from the 1950s onwards. So in a way, if you read, say, something like Running in the Family against a text like Martin Wickramasinghe, I don't know, many of you probably have not heard of him, but Martin Wickramasinghe is perhaps the most important 20th century literary figure in Sri Lanka. His novel Gamperaliya is considered, an iconic achievement because it's perhaps the most articulate expression of a realist novel in 20th century Sri Lanka. It was the first novel that had all the features of a robust realist narrative, and he was also influenced a lot by Russian writers like Dostoevsky, etc. So he drew a lot of inspiration from there, but he was also well versed in English Anglophone British literature as well. So now, if you look at somebody like Martin Wickramasinghe and compare, he has a book called Kalunika Sevima, In Search of the Kalunika. Kalunika is this magical or sort of miraculous plant which people claim exists deep inside tropical forests, but nobody's ever been able to find it. And what Wickramasinghe is trying to do is to use it as a metaphor to talk about a sense of authenticity that he is attempting to discover, but it is always kind of out of reach. So it's very creatively articulated, the title. And what Wickramasinghe is doing in this book, Kalunika Sevima, is that he is trying to imaginatively and literally, in a way, returning to his village roots. So he's an urban, educated intellectual, now trying to go back to and finding his, sort of the authentic village life, the authenticity of his cultural roots. And this is, of course, a familiar trope, right? In a lot of post-colonial literature, you see this. But what is interesting in terms of Wickramasinghe is that, like, he goes back to his village, which is in the south of Sri Lanka near Galle, which is a resort town. And when he goes back, he finds that a Royal Air Force base has been established in Koggala by that time. This is towards the tail end of colonialism, towards the latter parts of the 1940s, the decade of the 1940s. And so he has, the physical landscape itself has changed, right? It has been transformed by the colonial encounter. But through that base, he then penetrates deeper. So it's both a psychological journey as well as a literal journey. So he goes past the base, he drives past it, enters into the village of his childhood, and there begins to rediscover a kind of a very authentic, primal, very pastoral kind of life. So it's a recovery of something that has been lost. So the entire book is structured in that way. Later on, he goes to the northern plains of Sri Lanka, where you get a lot of archaeological evidence, like old stupas, etc., of Sri Lanka's past civilization, and he begins to talk about those also in a very kind of a documentary way. So this is also a journey, right? A journey of rediscovery, but it is a very different kind of journey to the journey that somebody like Ondaatje experiences, or Ondaatje charts in Running in the Family. Almost diametrically opposite, I would say. Because in Ondaatje's Running in the Family, there is no such quest for a settled sense of origin or being or a sense of authentic life. Instead, in Ondaatje's parents, Mervyn and Doris, and their unconventional freewheeling lifestyle, what one sees is a metonym for a larger struggle of how to imagine the post-colonial condition and the post-colonial nation. In a way, it is an attempt to come to terms with a violent colonial past. And so in Ondaatje's journey, in a way, he's trying to come to terms with that sort of the colonial history of his own lineage, right? So the sections of the novel that deal with the Dutch occupation, for instance, doesn't actually romanticize the Dutch occupation. It shows its violence quite clearly, quite explicitly. But however, what is really significant in Ondaatje's invocation of this past hybrid legacy is that it is embraced as a part of his current ontological condition. There is no attempt to kind of expunge it, whereas in somebody like Wickramasinghe, there is an attempt to kind of erase that colonial encounter and to recover some kind of authentic past. So this is why I said it's kind of diametrically opposite. For Ondaatje, it is inescapable, the colonial encounter, because he is very much a product of that as well. And there is a acceptance, that there's a reconciliation with that in a way, right? And the problem with nationalist thinking that sort of goes in search of this pre-colonial kind of romantic past is that it produces a certain kind of politics and a national consciousness that scholars like Amir Mufti have called a culture of post-colonial mourning, because there is always this sense of the Garden of Eden or that originary moment, and we see our present context as a fallen one. And in a way, there's this unending quest for recovery, this unending quest to reconnect with that past. But for Ondaatje, that does not appear as a prominent theme or a prominent imperative in his writing. Right. So what I would argue is that Ondaatje's Running in the Family produces both an individual orientation to the past as well as a larger worldview of the past that is able to accommodate the perceived ruptures of the colonial encounter. This, to me, is a way of thinking and feeling beyond the nation, and it's in its parochial and purist sense. Next, I would like to briefly turn to another of Ondaatje's novels that deals with Sri Lanka in a substantive sense, that is Anil's Ghost. This is, of course, a text that is very different both in form and content to Running in the Family, and does not invite comparison in any explicit or direct sense. I mean, placing the two texts together is also a little difficult methodologically and in terms of form and content. However, the manner in which I place these two texts together in this talk is through the notion of literary cosmopolitanism, with which I frame the entire talk. Anil's Ghost deals with a period of Sri Lankan history from the late 1980s, when the country dealt with its second youth uprising in Sinhala society in the south of the country. led by the Maoist JVP, or the People's Liberation Front. This period witnessed a bloody paramilitary crackdown by the state, and it is believed that thousands of Sinhala youth were arbitrarily executed. I grew up amidst this, and I saw bodies piled up on the side of the roads, executed with no judicial process. In this text, Ondaatje creates an intriguing protagonist in Anil Thisera, the young Western-trained forensic pathologist who returns to her natal Sri Lanka after an absence of 15 years to intervene in the search for justice in the aftermath of the conflict. Some critics have seen Anil's character as representative of a kind of rootless cosmopolitanism enabled by the privilege of her first world citizenship, the kind of cosmopolitanism I spoke about earlier. She is a privileged person. Her education, her socio-cultural background gives her that. In that sense, Anil also stands as a signifier for a regime of international human rights discourse that intervenes in conflict hotspots like Sri Lanka with little long-term investment. In a way, they come, they sort of make a lot of sound, make a lot of noise, and then they're gone. There's no sustained intervention. However, Ondaatje also seems to craft Anil in terms where her rootless cosmopolitanism turns into something more invested in the place of her natal origin as her involvement with the forensic investigation deepens. Towards the end of the novel, when Anil reveals the findings of her investigation to government officials, and the last time she is featured in the novel with her local partner, Sarath Diyasena, she says, "You killed hundreds of us." A use of the collective pronoun us that appears to suggest that Anil, at least in the sense of a victimized Sri Lankan, identifies with the Sri Lankan people. So us, she makes that critical identification, just like I told you that, in Ondaatje's quote, he says our sense of belonging, right? So while Anil's Ghost has nothing of the autobiographical resonance of running in the family, I would like to stretch the reading of the novel to suggest that it is a novel that deals with the expatriate's complex relationship with his or her place of origin. In interviews Ondaatje has in the interviews that Ondaatje has given, he has spoken about how difficult it was to visit Sri Lanka during the war years, and how he tried to do so with an open mind and not to be judgmental about Sri Lanka or its politics. Indeed, for diasporic individuals as well as communities, this is a particular challenge, and I think Julie just spoke about this in her opening remarks about how in her Canadian classrooms there was friction between the Sinhala and Tamil diasporic students. As we all know, Sri Lanka's conflict is heavily internationalized, with Sri Lankan and Tamil Sinhala diasporic communities in many parts of the world, including in Canada, playing a direct and critical role in the conflict. Such intervention can often be shaped with a less than adequate understanding of local realities and be based on romantic idealizations, based on the migrants' memory of the past. So this is also a problem of the diasporic imagination in a way, because they are no longer here. They have left or have been compelled to leave, and many carry certain memories, and those memories are then passed intergenerationally, and that shapes the perception of what is going on in the country. Of course, given today's sort of highly mediatized world, news from Sri Lanka obviously travels to any other part of the world very fast, but what we must understand is news is not a substitute for living on the ground and experience something at a very affective sense by being there. Right. But in the case of Anil Thisera in Anil's Ghost, she re-enters Sri Lanka without such presumptions. And is keenly conscious of the inadequacy of her knowledge of the Sri Lankan context. So she does not enter here as some kind of holding on to a view that she understands Sri Lanka. She enters pretty much as a stranger in a way. It is much later, after a painstaking process of engaging in her professional work of forensic reconstruction, a process that in some ways that mimics a cultural and affective reconnection with Sri Lanka. So, she reconstructs sailors' face, and in a way that is like a metonym or a metaphor for her own reconstruction and reconstitution of a kind of Sri Lankan identity, that Anil decides to take a stand and to intervene rather than function as a dispassionate scientific observer. So it is after that process that she decides, I have to take a stand. I believe, therefore, that it is possible to read Anil's Ghost Ghost, also from the perspective of Ondaatje's own complex and multifaceted relationship to Sri Lanka as a place. While it is always a dangerous and risky proposition as a literary critic or scholar to read a writer biographically, I think some of the multiple threads of Ondaatje's literary career and fictional practice that I've explored here does support the view that Ondaatje maintains a deep and abiding concern about his relationship to Sri Lanka and the complex cultural politics that shape this relationship. Now, let me briefly return to the theme of cosmopolitanism and its complex relationship to nationalism by way of a conclusion. Cosmopolitanism as a concept has always had a utopian intellectual genealogy, and it has also had a kind of intellectual as well as socio-cultural elitism. It is considered an orientation to life and a worldview that stands in opposition to various forms of parochialism and provincialism. In today's world, often the diametric opposite of cosmopolitanism is seen as nationalism. However, my contention is that such a simple binary configuration is unhelpful either as a conceptual orientation or a socio-cultural dispensation. At a very fundamental level, the very notion of cosmopolitanism is shaped by the existence of the nation and nationalism. For instance, in one of the foundational European thinkers of cosmopolitanism, Immanuel Kant, the cosmopolitan imagination emerges out of the need to think and feel beyond the nation, and to extend the notion of rights of man beyond the borders of the nation. It is therefore in a world system configured by a family of nations that the modern notion of cosmopolitanism emerges. Without the nation and its pursued insularity, a cosmopolitan imagination cannot exist. The nation in this sense is cosmopolitanism's epistemological and ontological other. It is also salutary to remember that the nation itself, of course, is a fiction. Nations have no ontological stability. They are human constructs. But like many other human fictions, or what the philosopher Ian Hacking calls interactive kinds, Ian Hacking talks about two different phenomenon in the world. One he calls indifferent kinds. Indifferent kinds are like trees or rocks or inanimate objects, right? You can label them, you can name them. It doesn't matter to the tree. The tree goes on living as a tree. But interactive kinds are kinds where when you put a category or a label on them, you call them Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Sinhala, whatever, that then produces its own social reality. Once you label somebody, once you name somebody, they begin to perform the identity encoded in that label. So they are interactive kinds, right? So while nations are ontological fictions, I mean, God didn't create nations. Nations don't, there's nobody drew a nation on the world map. These are very much human constructs. So they are not ontologically real, but socially very real. They are categories of practice. They determine how we live, what happens to us, what is possible and what is not possible, our sense of belonging and unbelonging. All of this is shaped by nations. In that sense, when Ondaatje intervenes, whether in a symbolic or real sense in Sri Lanka, he does so as someone who is marked by his Canadian and first world nation status that is inseparable, that is an inescapable reality. The strength, I would argue, in both Ondaatje's literary as well as real interventions. Real, basically, I'm talking about the Gratian Trust here and what he did to uplift English language writing in Sri Lanka, is his keen political consciousness about the asymmetries of power that shape this encounter. In literary terms, as I have briefly explored through Running in the Family and Anil's Ghost, he invites the reader to imagine Sri Lanka differently as a place of multiple belongings, implicitly contrasting his fictional practice with Sri Lanka's highly ethno-nationally charged political reality. But at the same time, the returning emigre writer is deeply conscious of his alienation from his natal culture and avoids any kind of presumptive knowledge of the place called Sri Lanka, which is a far cry from the shrill interventionist attitude of both Sinhala and Tamil diasporas spread across the world. As a trustee of the Gratian Trust for almost a decade, I can also say that Ondaatje's literal intervention in Sri Lankan creative writing industry has been equally sensitive and keenly politically conscious. While Ondaatje's name and the endowment he provided for the trust remain its key strengths, the trust itself operates completely autonomously. responding to and addressing a dynamic and changing Sri Lankan reality with minimal interference from its founder benefactor. In this, I believe, Michael Ondaatje practices what Edward Said calls affiliation. Affiliation is a critical but effective relationship to your natal culture that is forged by the experience of distance and expatriation. One still maintains a certain filial love for one's natal culture, but it is tempered by a critical distance that allows one to step outside the confines of one's national culture and critically reflect upon it. To me, this seems the best kind of cosmopolitanism, one that is simultaneously both within and outside the nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Harsha, for this tour de force, for this lecture that is a total tour de force. You have spanned the idea of literary cosmopolitanism in a unique manner. You've told us how Ondachi urges us to think beyond the nation, and how our view of the nation often inhibits our ways of in creating or engaging with a more unified world. It's sort of a stumbling block to that. You've also told us how Fatherland is a gendered view of looking at the nation, which again, flows from Ondaatje's own conceptualization of the father and the fatherland. And then you said that there's a dark side as well as a positive side to fatherland. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritties of the dark side, but we all know what that is, and then that there's a positive side as well. And then you've told us that cosmopolitanism and nationalism are two ends of the spectrum. They are at odds with each other. And it is hard to see how any sort of reconciliation can take place. For Ondaatje, the colonial encounter, you said, is inescapable. He doesn't try to hide it or to sort of obscure it in any way, as some novelists in the present day have tried to do, as you point out. So, and then, of course, you say that there are certain very important autobiographical linkages between Running the Family and Anil's Ghost. Whilst the latter is not a work of autobiography, there is much of Ondaatje in there. And certainly, there is a sympathy for the victims of warfare that Ondaatje himself probably experiences. So to sum up, you said that the nation is an ontological fiction, which is so true, because it is on the one hand an imagined space, as we know, and it is a constructed space as well, as Raymond William would tell us, that we don't feel any loyalty towards an airport or a supermarket as we do towards the constructed idea of a nation. So the whole idea of belonging and belongingness is what you've taken us through in this very, very, very interesting talk, where you engaged both with the facts, the novel, as well as with the theories underlying all of it. So I thank you very much for it. And I now hand you over to Julie to take the conference forward from here. Julie?
The first plenary lecture is by Dr. Deborah Sridhara, Associate Professor, Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University, and the co-director of the Center for Canadian Studies at the Comparative Literature Department of the Jadavpur University. She's a friend, and her litany of awards sound like a wish list for many scholars. Deborah Sri has been the recipient of a Fulbright Alumni Award 2019 the Shastri Mobility Program at McGill University, the Psychops Fellowship at the University of Pavia, Italy, a Fulbright Nehru Visiting Lecturer Fellowship at UC Berkeley, the Erasmus Mundus Fellowship at State University of New York, Stony Brook, areas of research, education, gender, narrative, comparative Indian literature, mythology, and folklore. She's author of Oral Traditions of the Northeast, a case study of Karbi oral traditions, and is co-edited At the Crossroads of Literature and Culture, 2016, following Hawkhead Paths, Discussions on the Narrative, 2017, Eco-Criticism and Environment, Rethinking Literature and Culture, 2017, and has been issue editor for a special volume, Indigenous Studies for Literate, an Indian Response to Literature, December 2017 too. Wow, that was a busy year, Devoshri. She's principal investigator for the Jadavpur University RUSA 2.0 project on locating indigeneity in the Global South, revival, conservation, sustainability. With her co-director, Devoshri is, I think, perhaps one of the most forceful and yet prolific, productive promoters of Canadian literature and culture in India. So with that, Devoshri, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Julie. First of all, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. The Rising Asia Journal, we've had a long-term collaborative exchanges with Dr. Julie Mehta and Dr. Harish Mehta for a very long time at the Center for Canadian Studies at Jadavpur University. And my apologies for joining late, but we've been having our MA admissions going on, so which is why the coordinator of the center, Professor Sucharita Chattopadhyay, couldn't be here, but he sent her greetings for the conference and best wishes with her apologies. And so I know time is of the essence, and we did hear Julie be talking about being a bad cop, so I'm a little worried, but I'm hoping that we'll stick to the time. Quick things, I'm very glad that Professor Rambukwella talked about Vikram Singhe in the earlier part of his keynote lecture, which I think was really wonderful to listen to. I'm going to do a few things, and I will have a PowerPoint and other things, but before that, a basic sense of, I would like to begin by listening to Ondaatje himself. So let us begin with that.
This is called a cinnamon peeler. If I were a cinnamon peeler, I would ride your bed and leave the yellow bark dust on your pillow. Your breasts and shoulders would reek. You could never walk through markets without the profession of my fingers floating over you. The blind would stumble, certain of whom they approached, though you might bathe under rain gutters monsoon. Here on the upper thigh, at this smooth pasture, neighbor to your hair, or the crease that cuts your back, this ankle, you will be known among strangers as a cinnamon peeler's wife. I could hardly glance at you before marriage, never touch you, your keen-nosed mother, your rough brothers. I buried my hands in saffron, disguised them over smoking tar, helped the honey gatherers. When we swam once, I touched you in water, and our bodies remained free. You could hold me and be blind of smell. You climbed the bank and said, "This is how you touch other women," the grass cutter's wife, the lime burner's daughter. And you searched your arms for the missing perfume, and knew, what good is it to be the lime burner's daughter? Left with no trace, as if not spoken to in the act of love, as if wounded without the pleasure of a scar. You touched your belly to my hands in the dry air and said, "I am the cinnamon peeler's wife. Smell me."
So I'm hoping that this sets a rhythm for what I would like to talk about. I am reminded at this point of James Joyce, who left Ireland at a very, very young age. He was very young when he left, almost near about 3-4 years difference, the time that Ondachi had left Sri Lanka. And Joyce hardly ever returned to to Ireland. And and there was this journalist who had asked him that, why didn't you ever return to Ireland? And his response was, have I ever left it? I think that sets up the tone as far as Ondachi is concerned, and so if you look at this, and I'm looking at the set, and I started to read the Running in the Family, which is something that I want to talk about when I talk about Ondachi. And I decided to look at it backwards rather than not try to maintain a linearity as far as time and space is concerned with Ondachi. And if you look at this particular set of acknowledgements that he gives, he calls the literary work a communal act, and that this book couldn't have been imagined, let alone conceived, without the help of many people. And where he goes on to talk about the composite of 2 return journeys to Sri Lanka, something that most of us in this room are familiar with. COVID-19 and its aftermath marked an important juncture for an understanding of diasporic subjectivities that challenge and renegotiate essentialist conceptualizations of identity, particularly within the theoretical matrix provided by migration and displacement. In reclaiming the tacit dimension, George Kalamaras has used the expression non-conceptual awareness to describe a mode of knowing that is not related to the logos. Kalamaras' notion is emblematic of Ondaatje's understanding of a utopia of presence, a nowhere in my conscious mind, a utopia that is beyond language as logos. How do we understand this? How do we look at this process? If you look at this little section from Jaffna Afternoons, and it gives you a sense of space that Ondaatje is trying to imagine, a sense of nostalgia with, again, a very, very important sense of continued presence that he talks about. I sit in the huge living room of the old governor's home in Jaffna, the walls painted in recent years, a warm rose red, stretched awesome distances away, to my left, to my right, and up towards a white ceiling. And look at this subtle change towards a sense of history when he goes on. When the Dutch first built this house, egg white was used to paint the walls. The doors are 20 feet high, as if awaiting the day when a family of acrobats will walk from room to room sideways without dismantling themselves from each other's shoulders. But it's interesting to see that what he tries to do in Running in the Family is dismantling the sense of home that he has tried to evoke in different ways. Of course, one can talk about his relationship with his father, his different multiple migrations to England and Canada, but that's commonplace. But what I'm interested is Ondaatje's Over, which brings to the forefront the most unresolved contradictions within normative frameworks. In relation to the writing of a Canadian literary history, Dermot McCarthy speaks of the fusion of topocentric and logocentric premises that provide an interpretation of Canadian literature as expressing the voice of the people, and to the canonical privileging of only those works which express the spirit of place or spirit of people. How do we look into the spirit of people? Let's read a little bit more. A little section from Tropical Gossip. Where is the intimate and truthful in all this? Teenager and uncle, husband and lover, a lost father in his solace. And why do I want to know of his privacy? After the cups of tea, coffee, public conversations, I want to sit down with someone and talk with utter directness. Want to talk to all the lost history like that deserving lover. I found this particular section from Ondachi from Running in the Family very poignant because of two things. One is we have spent around 1.5 years living in social exclusion almost, and one of the most difficult periods. And I believe the discipline of comparative literature where I come from helps me to engage with the world that has been bound or forced to know the other in these circumstances. To know the other, to know the presence of the other, to know the relationship with what the other has to offer. Running in the Family rethinks boundaries of diasporic identities that challenge and redefine the proclivities of narrative history by interrogating both the absolute understanding of the past and the ideological affinities as embedded in historical representations of both the past and the present. If you look into the next section, just look at this. This little cartography that is etched by Ondachi gives you a sense of the porousness of borders that comes into being. And it becomes we've lived through a very strange year and a half where borders have been sealed, but this is also one of the most porous moments in border studies at this point, as you and I are talking right now today. Ceylon falls on a map and its outline is the shape of a tear. After the spaces of India and Canada, it is so small, a miniature. Drive 10 miles and you're in a landscape so different that by night it should belong to another country. From Galle in the south to Colombo, a third of the way up, the coast is only 70 miles. When houses were built along the coastal road, it was said that a chicken could walk between the two cities without touching ground. The country is cross-hatched with maze-like roofs whose only escape is the sea. From a ship or plane, you can turn back or look down at the disorder. Villages spill onto trees, onto streets. The jungle encroaches on village. I want you to take notice of this whole idea of the cartography of grief that is etched by Ondachi in his very mapping out of the geographical space of Ceylon. Right? Ondachi's travel narrative memoir that we call The Running in the Family revisits this tantalizing presence of the everyday in the context of a home space evoked through the power of the political imaginary. In Four Rides from the Dainty Monsters, we find the speaker glimpses a photograph and a painting through the eyes of his lover and is driven to record this moment, to compete with the power of the camera and the brush to capture a slice of time. I would freeze this moment and in supreme patience place pianos and craggy black horses on a beach and in immobilized time attempt to reconstruct. Even in these very early lyrics, the desire for artistic fixity becomes an obsessive theme. The everyday in Running in the Family not only disrupts the relationship between memory and history, but has the potential to re-articulate the trajectory of narratives of the own space through fluid cultural and spatial representations. One must ask at this moment, how is memory and history constructed, interpreted, transmitted, and transformed? How do voices and silences and narratives shape memory and history? The complex relation between memory and history reveals that history is willing to question the epistemological status of its object of study, the past, but less ready to engage with how the past itself is variously conceptualized and constituted as history, memory, or archive. In this context, the significance of narratives, such as Running in the Family, in the study of memory and history, for our understanding of culture and construction of meaning, foreground contests in the past and social and political dimensions of memory, experienced, produced, and conveyed through diverse media, which is also why I wanted to look at that particular section by Ondachi in the beginning. If we look at it, when he began drinking, and this is of course the final section that you have, when he began drinking, I would just get lost. That was easy to do at Rock Hill. He'd be insensible, and then when he was getting better, he was like an angel and would do anything for you. There was a song he used to sing when he was drunk, over and over. He had made it up, and he sang it only when he was really drunk. Partly English and partly Sinhalese, a bit like a baila, as it used brand names and street names and gibberish. It made no sense to anyone, but it wasn't gibberish to him because he always sang exactly the same words each time. I looked at this particular section because it evoked the felicity of language. It evoked the empowerment possible with the reclaiming of language that works through Ondaatje's text. Through text, and it again takes me back to something like Dubliners, where if we know that how Joyce mentioned that if Dublin was to be destroyed, everybody would know how to recreate Dublin from what they heard from Dubliners. Whether that's possible or not is not important, but what's important over here is the way in which this was evoked, the way in which one tries to understand the reclamation of language, a language that marks our accessibility to a space that is not ours anymore, that is not willing to be part of our existence, perhaps at this point, right? What we want to know is that the basic premise of memory has been its relentless effort to resist often inaccurate and fabricated central narratives of control called history. Memory acts as a safeguard against attempts to silence voices of transgression and dissidence. And in turn, memory is often implicated in that silencing, situating the role of memory and historical events within local, national, transnational contexts and temporalities. One who formulates a broader conversation of the making of race and nation, the history of a nation and public memory, aesthetic responses to violence and memorialization practices. In order to negotiate the omissions of history and its authoritarian position, alternative accounts of oppression and injustice have been sought by Ondaatje in Running in the Family. It appears more a case of disenchantment, a sense of unease, a rejection of history written with a capital H. Some have gone to the extent of stating that history doesn't make sense, whereas memory is concrete. In other words, what is important is to recollect the past in our own ways, which is precisely what Ondaatje tries to attempt in Running in the Family, rather than through this particular history written with a capital H. The discourse of memory is concerned with representation and the present, as opposed to only the past and the fact. If we looked into the synesthetic effect of Cinnamon Peeler, one of course, which is also included as a poem in Running in the Family, we can understand the kind of affective affinity that the keynote speaker also spoke about, and how that brings to the forefront certain ways of knowing the world. Moreover, it subverts any kind of absolutist assertion of historical truth and approaches the past in a more qualified manner, albeit provisionally and subjectively. As memory is framed against history, a narrative of exclusion, extermination, and resistance is created. And the truth claim of that narrative challenges established hierarchies of race, class, and gender. Questions on the relation between memory and history are articulated within a larger framework of the relation between past and present. As Ondaatje flits through different continents, travels through different ways of knowing the world, travels through different genres within Running in the Family, it's a beautiful contamination of genres that Running in the Family provides us. These are the encounters between memory and history that are staged through the narrative that we have, which in itself is a construction, a representation in diverse interdisciplinary forms, literature, media, performance. The blurred and fluid boundaries between history and memory are most apparent in such narratives, which have resisted mainstream ideas of history and have created a collective story, or what Ronald Takaki refers to as a community of memory. I look into my final slide now, which is of course Martin Wickramasinghe in the Kali Yogaya. Thinking is a kind of wandering. Reasoning becomes useful only to let the mind wander in the directions you want it to be. We began the conversation with Ondachi, and we will end it with Ondachi as well. And I will end with this little clip that I want you to see.
This is a poem I wrote for my niece in Sri Lanka, who sang me some songs in a terrible voice. And I came across some lines by Paul Bowles, who said, "The Sinhalese are beyond a doubt one of the least musical people in the world. It would be quite impossible to have less sense of pitch, line, or rhythm." And so this poem is called Sweet Like a Crow for Hetty Correa, 8 years old. Your voice sounds like a scorpion being pushed through a glass tube, like someone has just drawn a peacock, like wind howling in a coconut, like a rusty Bible, like someone pulling barbed wire across a stone courtyard, like a prig drowning, a vataka being fried, a bone shaking hands, a frog singing at Carnegie Hall. Like a crow swimming in milk, like a nose being hit by a mango, like the crowd at the Royal Thomian match, a womb full of twins, a paria dog with a magpie in its mouth, like the midnight jet from Casablanca, like Air Pakistan curry, a typewriter on fire, like a spirit in the gas which cooks your dinner, like 100 papadungs being crunched, like someone uselessly trying to light 3 roses matches in a dark room, the clicking sound of a reef when you put your head into the sea, a dolphin reciting epic poetry to a sleepy audience, the sound of a fan when someone throws brinjals at it, like pineapples being sliced in the Pattaya market, like Beetlejuice hitting a butterfly in midair, like a whole village running naked onto the street and tearing their sarongs, like an angry family pushing a jeep out of the mud, like dirt on the record needle, like 8 sharks being carried on the back of a bicycle, like 3 old ladies locked in the lavatory, like the sound I heard when having an afternoon sleep and someone walked through my room in ankle bracelets.
Deborah, compellingly argued.
Thank you very much for allowing me to share the rhythm of Michael Ondaatje. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Deborah. I'll hold my tongue for now, though I'm just about bursting to talk to you about a few things that you mentioned. The multiple ways of looking at the world and yet being at home. I think you picked up on the points that Professor Rambukwella had noted in his keynote, and I just adored the way that you brought the Irish element of James Joyce into the party, because he's a very welcome guest, and the spirit of place, the spirit of people, lost father in his solace, all of that, I think, points to Ondaatje's oeuvre of the need for communal work, and he always acknowledges that. Thank you for that, Deborah. We'll come back to a big conversation with Dr. Roma Bhattacharya once Dr. Jean Carol Ewart has presented, and she's going to speak to us about the problem of page 189, intertext in running in the family. So we are thrilled to have Jean here, who holds an MA and PhD in comparative literature from the University of Pennsylvania, where she specialized in narratology and the French Nouveau Roman. She's a research librarian at the University of Florida, where she has taught running in the family for nearly 2 decades. There, she supports the programs in global literatures in English and in film studies. Her interests lie in the formal study of the narrative. Most recently, she's published papers on etymology and naming in William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. The narrative economies of a comic strip in Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and the ironic narrative voice in the poetry of Margaret Atwood. Much to look forward to. Take it away, Jean.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. In the interest of time this evening, I've cut a rather lengthy introduction to my topic, which was intended for the new reader of Running in the Family. I know I'm in knowledgeable company here, so I will go straight to the issue at the center of my talk. For the first 11 years that Running in the Family was in print, readers encountered a strange metatextual moment at the end of the novel. In the chapter entitled Thanakama, Ondaatje pictures his father, drunk, returning home alone from the city of Colombo to the family estate of Rock Hill late at night, having failed to persuade his soon-to-be ex-wife Doris to reconcile with him or even to speak to him following the breakup of the home. The details of this scene must have been imagined by Ondaatje. He was a child of 3 or possibly 4 and living with his mother in Colombo at the time. No one else was present that night to witness this. In the house, Mervyn looks for the book he has been reading and eventually finds it on the bathroom floor, where it is being slowly carried off by the ants which constantly invade the house in this tropical climate. In the bathroom, ants had attacked the novel thrown on the floor by the commode, Ondaatje tells us, and a whole battalion was carrying one page away from its source, carrying the intimate print as if rolling a tablet away from him. He knelt down on the red tile, slowly, not wishing to disturb their work. It was page 189. In all early editions of the memoir, the alert reader, glancing down, would have seen that this sentence actually appeared on page 189 of Running in the Family. The page 189 reference appeared on that page in every early edition, including the Canadian, the British and the American hardcovers, and the Penguin and vintage trade paperbacks, suggesting that the subsequent editions had been set using the original pagination of the first edition. Page numbering for the first text page always begins at 17, no matter how many initial pages there actually are, and even if they are unnumbered. The font is identical, even though all 3 major presses for the hardcovers have in-house designers and style sheets. I'm omitting here a lengthy comment on the degree to which Ondaatje insists on authorial control over the physical appearances of his books, and also what instructions would have to go to the typesetter to achieve this effect, since he couldn't have known what page it would appear on when he was writing out longhand or typing. I have taught Running in the Family now for almost 20 years, and I have a theory about what is happening in this scene, why Ondaatje wanted it, and how it is intricately linked to the rest of the memoir. I'd like to start by noting how many literary allusions, or more specifically intertexts, appear in these 2 pages, including references to at least 3 Shakespeare plays, J.M. Barrie, Michael Arlen, Lactasa Vikramasena, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. These intertexts begin as Mervyn reaches Thanakama and sits in the house in a stupor. I'm going to read a lengthy passage to you. I've put it up so you can see it also. He saw himself with the bottle. Where was his book? He had lost it. It was not Shakespeare, not those plays of love he wept over too easily, with dark blue bindings. You creaked them open and stepped into a room full of sorrow, a midsummer dream. All of them had moved at times with an ass's head, Titania, Dorothy, Hilden, Lysander de Sarum, a mongrel collection, part Sinhalese, part Dutch, part Tamil, part ass, moving slowly in the forest with foolish and serious obsessions. No, he looked around the bare room. Don't talk to me about Shakespeare, about green hats. The reader will never learn the title of the book Mervyn was reading, but the passage itself is a rich collection of references to other books read and loved by the family. A Midsummer Night's Dream is only the most obvious intertextual reference. Titania and Lysander's names are mingled with those from Mervyn and Doris's social circle. The commingling of the Sri Lankan names with those of Shakespeare's characters, however, suggests the tragedies as well as the comedies. For Ondaatje uses this structure of mixed names only one other time in the memoir to refer to two of Shakespeare's tragedies, Hamlet and King Lear. In that instance, he references not his parents' generation, but his own, exploring their victimization by the excesses of their elders. Just 10 pages before the mention of the Midsummer Dream, and still fresh in the reader's mind, occur these lines. During certain hours, at certain years in our lives, we see ourselves as remnants from the earlier generations that were destroyed. So our job becomes to keep peace with enemy camps, eliminate the chaos at the end of the Jacobean tragedies, and with the mercy of distance, write the histories. Fortinbras, Edgar, Christopher, my sisters, Wendy, myself, I think all of our lives have been terribly shaped by what went on before us. And why, of Shakespeare's cast of characters, do I remain most curious about Edgar, who, if I look deeper into the metaphor, torments his father over an imaginary cliff? Puck's forest games evince the magical world of Mervyn's decadent youth, but Hamlet and King Lear evoke darker family problems, closer to Ondaatje's own concerns. Fortinbras, and especially Edgar, are characters who have been placed in difficult, even intolerable positions by their parents. Edgar's role is one to which Ondaatje will obsessively return. At the play's end, Edgar, who has been unjustly accused and rejected by his uncomprehending parent, wants his suicidal father to choose life over death. He fools the blind Gloucester into believing he is throwing himself over a cliff. In fact, it is a small hill. When Gloucester survives this terrible fall, Edgar further convinces him that this is a sign that he should fight to live. The structure of this scene of simulated death is repeated in Ondaatje's description of Mervyn's collapse in the Thanakama chapter. Ondaatje's text reads like a death scene, beginning portentously with the words, "For about 10 minutes, he sat in front of the house, now fully aware that the car was empty, but for his body, this corpse." But after the imagined events of this evening in 1947, Mervyn, like Gloucester, will get up, go on, live. He will remarry and raise another set of children. He will not die until 1965. In King Lear, Edgar is disguised as poor Tom, the madman, during the false death scene, and Ondaatje says of him, "I long for the moment in the play where Edgar reveals himself to Gloucester, and it never happens." It does in fact happen, it happens off stage. Addressing then his own father, with whom he had no face-to-face contact as an adult, he says, "Look, I am the son who has grown up. I am the son you have made hazardous, who still loves you. I am now part of an adult ceremony, but I want to say I am writing this book about you at a time when I am least sure about such words. Give me your arm. Let go my hand. Give me your arm. Give the word. Sweet marjoram, a tender herb." This series of slightly misquoted imperatives frame the false death scene in King Lear. "Give me your hand," says Edgar to his father, telling him they stand within a foot of the extreme verge. Gloucester, bribing poor Tom to go off and leave him to jump, replies, "Let go my hand." Then, when Gloucester falls down some little way, Edgar rushes to him to help him up and says, "Give me your arm." Sweet marjoram, the password which clears Edgar and Gloucester to Lear when he appears on the scene moments later, is a traditional funeral herb used to strew the floors and carry in nosegays in the presence of death, because its strong scent masks decay. Back on page 189, Ondaatje moves beyond Shakespeare to reference two other texts important to the Ondaatje family tragedy. "No," Mervyn thinks, as he looks around the bare room, "don't talk to me about Shakespeare, about green hats." The mention of green hats seems obscure unless the reader remembers that some 20 pages earlier, Ondaatje had noted that his mother's sense of theater and romance was fed by vociferous readings of J.M. Barrie and Michael Arlen. Michael Arlen's extremely successful post-World War I novel, The Green Hat, portrayed the excesses of the London glitterati and has something in common in that regard with Running in the Family. Another green hat, of course, was made famous by J.M. Barrie in Peter Pan, and the two green hats are not unconnected. In Arlen's novel, the central character, Iris, wears a green hat because she reveres J.M. Barrie. And Peter Pan is also suggested by the presence of a Wendy in Running in the Family, in the line, Fortinbras, Edgar, Christopher, my sisters Wendy, myself. Wendy is the name of Ondaatje's cousin, Doris's only niece, but given the family's love of Barrie's novel, no doubt derived from the beloved mother-sister figure in Peter Pan, as of course metaphorically do all Wendys. Peter Pan is the story of lost children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. If they are not claimed in 7 days, they are sent far away to Neverland. The joke in Barrie's novel, of course, is that in the large Edwardian family, people didn't notice if this youngest went missing while his nurse was walking him in the park. In the wake of the Ondaatje parents' divorce, Christopher, Michael, and his sisters were split up, sent away, shuttled between guardians, aunts, uncles, and in general suffered from caretakers who were looking the other way. In Peter Pan, Wendy, John, and Michael are seduced out of the nursery window when their parents, busy with a hectic social schedule on their way to a party, go out to dinner, and the father bans the nursemaid Nana from the nursery in a fit of pique. Arlen's The Green Hat is also about lost children. The central character, Iris, must decide whether she should marry her childhood sweetheart, Napier, with whom she's been conducting an affair. It will mean tearing him away from his wife, Venice, who might or might not be pregnant, although he seems relatively willing to be torn. Iris has already been pregnant with Napier's child, the first lost child of the novel. That eagerly anticipated baby dies during a difficult delivery that also nearly kills Iris, who is warned not to have more children. Contemplating her moral quandary at the end of the novel, she speaks its moral core. We must all give way before children, always, always. If people had always done that, what miseries wouldn't the world have been spared? If Peter Pan and Running in the Family demonstrate how people may carelessly misplace their children, The Green Hat makes a case for hanging on to them. Arlen and Barrie and Ondaatje all make a case against the neglectful parent and a plea for children left by such parents. At the end of this scene, the line Ondaatje attributes to Mervyn, "Don't talk to me about Shakespeare, about green hats," ties together all these threads, Shakespeare, Barrie, and Arlen. The first half of the line is a quotation from a poem by Lakdasa Vikramasena, one of Sri Lanka's best-known poets. The poem, entitled "Don't Talk to Me About Matisse," is partially reproduced elsewhere in Running in the Family. When Ondaatje attributes to Mervyn the line, "Don't talk to me about Shakespeare, about green hats," he implies two possible readings for this intertext. First, Mervyn might be thinking to himself in the context of A Midsummer Night's Dream, "Don't talk to me about the glamour of my colonial past and the excesses of the Roaring Twenties." But Mervyn could also mean, in the context of the tragedies, "Don't talk to me about my responsibilities, about my now fatherless children, the small Edgars who will grow into questioning adults." The second reading is suggested by the evidence of Ondaatje's next paragraph, in which Mervyn looks at the busy ants and thinks duty, but then immediately dismisses them and their work, for that was just a fragment gazed at by the bottom of his eye. To return to page 189 then, I put this quote up too early. In the bathroom, ants had attacked the novel thrown on the floor by the commode. A whole battalion was carrying one page away from its source, carrying the intimate print as if rolling a tablet away from him. He knelt down on the red tile, slowly, not wishing to disturb their work. It was page 189. He had not got that far in the book yet, but he surrendered it to them. The white rectangle moved with the busy, arduous ants. Duty, he thought, but that was just a fragment gazed at by the bottom of his eye. He drank. This may be the most elusive of the intertexts of Running in the Family. It is obvious that something is happening here, for ants have no reason to steal paper. They don't eat it. They don't build nests with it. The reader coming to this passage for the first time must already have read 100 Years of Solitude, and probably recently, for this allusion to click. But Ondaatje knew it well, once calling it the Bible book of the 20th century. In the climactic scene of 100 Years of Solitude, the second to last of the Buendia family, Aureliano, has watched his beloved Amaranta Ursula die while giving birth to their son. Crushed by her death, he goes on a drinking binge in town, leaving the newborn alone in the house, and wakes up a day later in the home of a prostitute. Returning to the house, he finds the child dead, devoured by army ants. All that's left of the baby is a dry and bloated bag of skin that all the ants in the world are dragging away. Aureliano could not move, not because he was paralyzed by horror, but because at that prodigious instant the gypsy Melchiade's final keys were revealed to him. Realizing that the gypsy Melchiade's prophecy about the manuscript becoming readable when the last of the line is being eaten by ants has now come true, Aureliano leaves his son's skin to be consumed and rushes to read the manuscript, which will reveal to him his own origins and his true relationship to his dead lover, whom he thinks is his first cousin and suspects might be his sister. The narrator's sardonically understated value judgment in the phrase, not because he was paralyzed by horror, suggests how Aureliano should have reacted to his son's agonizing death. Aureliano's failure to nurture his son is the last in a long series of failures on the part of Buendia parents for the last 100 years to nurture their children. The baby's reduction to a dry and empty bag of skin points to the infant's and now the family's conversion in the final scene to a surface for writing, to vellum or parchment, which will blow away in the wind that engulfs Macondo. His only importance to Aureliano is as a key to understanding the pages of the Buendia history. The narrator has already laid the grounds for this analogy of skin to manuscript early in the novel, remarking that Melchiade's pages were bound in a material that was pale, like tanned human skin. Aureliano's choice of solipsism over parenting marks the end of the family line and the end of the novel, since, as the narrator remarks in closing, races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on earth. Aureliano returns from a drunken binge, and in his solipsism ignores the body of his dead son. The more industrious race, the ants, supplant the Buendias. In the scene imagined by Ondaatje, Mervyn returns from a drunken binge and in his solipsism ignores the body of his son's work, like Aureliano leaving duty to the ants. For Ondaatje, connecting his own book, Running in the Family, to the unknown novel his father was reading with the analogy of page 189, suggests that his father neglects his son in neglecting the physical artifacts of his son's profession. What his father sees being carried off by ants is a ghost of his son's writerly work, the intimate print, the son's self converted to vellum. Mervyn doesn't try to stop the ants, although he has not yet reached page 189 in that anonymous novel. Presumably, he was not engaged enough in the text to want to read that far, or to finish the novel. His son is a writer, but Mervyn is not an attentive reader. The nexus of literary allusions that pervades page 189, then, brings the reader through a series of blind, inattentive, neglectful parents to this final figure. The parent the son imagines will ignore or be indifferent to the writerly qualities of his child, the son that will grow up to write this romance about the father. This is my last paragraph. If this sounds like it has been a harsh indictment of Mervyn, and perhaps even of Michael, I do not intend it that way. Alcoholism is a devastating disease, often rooted in early social drinking, that is applauded by the surrounding culture, and Ondaatje shows us the glittering costume parties and admiring crowds that did indeed surround his father's early bouts with inebriation. Mervyn's acute social anxiety also certainly contributed to his willingness to drink to excess. The critique I have suggested in this scene is not obvious. It lies deeply buried in the intertext. My students call this lecture the Bad Dad Lecture. To see it, the reader must digest 3 Shakespeare plays, 3 novels, one virtually unknown today, one read by children, and one a 400-page mountain. The intertexts allow Ondaatje to express his anguish without doing so overtly, and even then he worries. On the very night that he writes the Thanakama chapter, returning us to the theme of father, solipsism, abandonment, and the unread page 189, Ondaatje records this in his journal. This is a slide of Monsoon Notebook 3. And immediately follows 189. A school exercise book. I write this at the desk of Calamander, looking out of the windows into dry black night. Thanakama, aloneness, birdness, the sound of an animal passing through the garden. Midnight and noon and dawn and dusk are the hours of danger, susceptibility to the grahayas, planetary spirits of malignant character. Avoid eating certain foods in lonely places. The devils will smell you out. carry some metal, an iron heart. Do not step on bone or hair or human ash. Every time I read this passage, I think of how Ondaatje has just walked across his father's grave and seen himself as alone, susceptible, in need of an iron heart. Thank you.
Jean, that was a fascinating talk. You unveiled the intertextuality almost like a detective unveiling a murder mystery. Absolutely awesome. And many things to take away from both yours and Debushri's plenaries. And I think we will open it up now as I quickly do an introduction, a thumbnail sketch of a very able and appropriate discussant. I'm glad she agreed to come on board. Dr. Roma Bhattacharya, DPhil from Oxford University, and has worked in the area of human rights for the purposes of time management. All I'll say to you is that she too has a whole litany of scholarships and very prestigious honors, but on point now, she has contributed significantly towards pioneering, influencing, and shaping United Nations global policy and institutional standards. She is very much aware about armed conflict from the vantage point of poor, marginalized populations, and her current emerging interests include bringing together perspectives from post-colonial writers such as Ondaatje towards reshaping our understanding of contemporary issues. Take it away, Roma. I'm right here with you if you need me to pop in.
Thank you so much, Julie B. I just want to first start by greeting everyone on this conference and thanking Professor Julie Mehta as well as Harish Mehta for inviting me to this wonderful evening. In the interests of time, what I'll do is just pick up on a few things that our fabulous two presenters have spoken about this evening, and then pose some larger questions, and then we can reflect together. I can't help but start by paying obeisance and a big thank you to Harsha Rambukwella on a very personal note, just to say thank you for your note of literary cosmopolitanism and imbuing this world with hope. We had the trope of the globe of fear, but you gave us hope, and thank you for that. In brief, I just want to first congratulate Deborah Sri. I mean, it was really a tour de force, and a lot of what you said resonated with me. The cinnamon peeler, I mean, Sri Lanka, the whole trope of the colonial narrative, some of the people, they can smell the cinnamon even before the island. It's an introduction to the island. And the whole notion of James Joyce's Have I Ever Left It? And the Dubliners' collective memory. But what I want to talk about specifically that fascinated me was the way you set up the whole business of history and memory. History being the more collective narratives written sometimes from the perspectives of power, from hegemony, maybe even authoritarian perspectives. And then there is the individual memory, which contests hierarchies. And you mentioned particularly, local understandings as well as the hierarchies of gender, which I've also been very involved in. For Dr. Dottare's reading, just to quote from her, she says that the novel makes us rethink memories, boundaries of diasporic identities by interrogating both the absolute understanding of the past and the historical representations of both the past and present. I think that was for me something really fascinating, the way you set up the notion of history versus memory. I want to just take this to one more level, if I may, and just pose a question, which we can of course answer together later on. And that is, at the heart of this novel, and Ondaatje, is a very tough job. And what is this tough job? The tough job is that he's talking about a journey back, which for a diasporic can never be a journey back. The absence of the father, these are some of the primal relationships of human beings. at the heart of that relationship is trauma. And beautifully, Jean has talked about the page 189, the dismemberment of the page by the ants and the dismemberment of the father-son relationship. So we're dealing with our topic, which is really silences and absences. And for me, a way into this is Ondaatje himself. I love the way both of you used Ondaatje's own words. And he says in an interview with Berkeley University, as well as in some other interviews, Ondaatje says the only way you can find the truth was to start by imagining what happened in the gaps. Now, I mean, this is just the thought I'll leave with Dr. Ray, and we can talk about it later. The thought in my mind is, if your text, if you like, is the gaps and the silences, then what Ondaatje is doing, which I think is absolutely unique, is he's constructing, in my view, a post-colonial historiography, because it's a way of recovering something that is fundamentally absent. And it is a narrative of something that is not a narrative. And in that context, I particularly, I'm sure Deborah Sri will agree with me that there is only one other parallel to this, and that is feminist historiography, because it's a reconstruction from these absences and gaps that we reconstruct feminist history. And to come back to the marvelous intertextuality and the fabulous unpicking by Jean, I'm sure we all want to thank her for it. But again, here I was wondering, Jean, if you would consider something, and that is, again, I take my cue from Ondaatje. You see, the dismemberment of page 189, and at the heart of it, the dismemberment of the father-son relationship. And in fact, one can be ironic and say, well, Edgar does try to simulate a cliff and ask Lear to jump off it. But in reality, there is no cliff, and Lear survives. But in the case of Ondaatje, the relationship is a dismembered one. And so here, Ondaatje, Jean, talks in his own interviews that he says, I think this is his way forward when we're looking at his particular art form and his contribution to literature. He's talking about his writing. He says it's very influenced by the aesthetics of jazz, because in jazz, silences and gaps can be explored. But more importantly for Jean's presentation, he says he's very influenced by the painting of Kurt Switzer and Robert Rauschenberg, which are, they're neo-Dada painters, but what they do is they use collage and assemblage for painting. And I think, just to wrap up before we go into this conversation, Jean, is this central notion of the dismembered page that you have zoomed the camera onto. It finds, he does have some, if you like, a cousin in the painting of collage and assemblage, because you talked about the eight grammaticalities, which is, I think, how do you write a narrative that isn't a narrative? And finally, before we go into our discussion, I'd just like to say that for me, the book is a million images, disrupted, belied narratives that one can never really unpick. Therein lies its poignancy and its contribution to art and literature. So, Jean, I would like you to think a little bit about really what you've said about intertextuality. We can't say anymore. You've really taken it to the ultimate level in your exquisite unpacking. But also, I just wondered if you could bring into the conversation a little bit, if you could tell us a little bit about your notion of grammaticalities, and the way this interrupts the narrative in the sense of conventional narrative. And I'm just suggesting that perhaps we can find a cousin, if you like, in the paintings of collage and assemblage. Yes, thank you. I'd love to hear from Deborah Sri first. If you want to talk a little bit about the gaps and silences in memory, as you said very beautifully.
I'm just going, Debashri, I'm just going to jump in here for a minute. For both you and Jean, the word dismemberment came in as a focal point that intersects both your papers. And one of the things I want us to think about is when we think of Ondaatje himself stating quite clearly that if it wasn't that he was a writer, he would rather be a jazz pianist because of the opportunities of reading between the bars of music, the silences, the ellipses, the gapses. But with that, Debashri, I want very much for you, who is also a post-colonialist in so many ways, and you understand human rights from a literary point of view, and to Jean as well, who's had a childhood in Africa, so she's seen this idea of dismemberment and dysfunctionality, disjointing of lives. How do we relate the literary and the musical to the theory of fractured nations and fractured homelands, which is why I think the word refractions is so central to what we're trying to talk about.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bhattacharya, and also thank you very much, Julie. I think even Jean's deeper insights into the text, and I read the fact that she's taught this text for 20 years. So it's a very, very nice relationship to be in. It's a wonderful relation to be in. I'm glad that you brought in the idea of music as well, especially the idea of jazz, because I think that was something that I wanted to harp on, but I didn't. Also, the fact was looking into these old Ceylonese spaces and photographs, which was also one of the videos that I wanted to show, but then I realized, okay, let's stick to Ondaatje and just speak about him. I think what makes Running in the Family such a wonderful book to read today as well is because of it having this transformative effect of not providing with any ultimate solutions at all. It doesn't really provide a solution. It's not pedantic. It's not condescending. It just gives you what it is. And I think that works in terms of our understanding of the world today as well. It's also very important because I think Ondaatje is constantly speaking about images. He's constantly speaking about his associations with, for example, filmmaking as well. The idea of the film that works with him, which is also about him thinking in terms of images that we speak about. Also, these spaces that he creates in Ceylon, I think these spaces, these moorings that he creates, I think that works in terms of our understanding of nostalgia, perhaps, and our unpacking of the word nostalgia itself. Also, I think it plays very beautifully because Ondaatje is aware of the weaknesses, if I may say so, of nostalgia itself. And I think if one reads into those weaknesses, it reads into the frozen memory, as we call within the diasporic concept about nostalgia. I think that's how we get into Ondaatje very importantly. I also felt that Running in the Family is a very important text to read right now in 2021, as we have all been in this whole idea of confinement. And this is a text that talks about confinement, that talks about different forms of confinement, whether that be psychological, whether that it also speaks very, I think it's a wonderful text that it does. It talks about mental health issues as well, without really articulating that word. And I think that's also why this text becomes so important. It talks about disease. It talks about performance through Ondaatje's mother and the figures that come in between it. It also speaks about the idea of the dysfunctional family. I think works in different ways. I'm not sure if people watch, if you've seen, for example, something like the modern Family, which is, as you know, it's a romantic comedy series, and it speaks about a dysfunctional family. But the point is, it is also very interesting because it kind of ended in the COVID cusp of that area, and you don't have it ended with some, I think 8 or 9 seasons, I forget which, but that again takes us back to Running in the Family. Running in the Family, I'm glad Sri is here as well. I actually remember reading a very well-thumbed book that I borrowed from her. This was this red book cover that you had of Running the Family, a small yellow book, and I think I borrowed it 20 years ago from her. So it's also a very different way of looking into the finiteness of the text for me. And I think, I mean, Julie B's question and Dr. Bhattacharya's drawing attention to that brings us also to the idea of the finiteness of the text as a space. As Ondaatje is very aware of the cartography of the text itself, I think. He's very, very keen on understanding that he is trying to create the image of the text and how he functions with that idea of the text. And also, if we look into it and think also in terms of the difficulty of approaching jazz, for example, is the difficulty of approaching or being one with jazz as a component is important, because that kind of delayed reception of jazz is something that works within Running in the Family as well. There's this very delectable delay that works in the text, and it helps you understand that you cannot arrive at conclusions as well. You cannot arrive at conclusions as far as even any construct of identity is concerned. It creates these apparatuses which make it very difficult to decide how do we read the text. The fact that we're talking about the text today after so many years speaks about the fluidity of the text and how it has found itself through these years, I think. If that answers the question. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And Jean, would you like to pitch in?
Yes, I would. So as you intuited, Roma, obviously this is a paper that is theorized through Michel Rifeter's work, and I did not include the word agrammaticality, I don't think, in the version that I actually read, but it's very much informing the longer version of the paper.
Exactly.
Yes. So in the Semiotics of Poetry, Rifeter argues for the, I guess I would say, transplanting of a term from linguistics into literary theory, which explains when you encounter an unknown text in a work of literature, a literary allusion, or he will use the word intertext. I think the distinction is whether it decorates or actually informs the meaning of the text in which it appears. When that happens, we can't parse it unless we recognize the intertext also. And one of the problems in page 189 is that many people will not recognize those intertexts. The obvious one is the one that's named A Midsummer Night's Dream, and the obvious author is the one who's named Lakdasa Vikramasena. But we won't necessarily be able to put together a whole structure made up of text where fathers are inattentive at best and dismissive at worst, or unseeing. And so I think it's important to realize that these fathers, the 6 of them who appear in the intertext, that they also form a kind of collage, that they form I'm trying to think of a visual metaphor. Actually the oral one, the jazz metaphor, is probably even better, that they are riffing on each other, that these texts are speaking to each other in the way that Rifeter describes intertext speaking to each other. And they're speaking about the position of the child when the child is disempowered and the adults, the parents, are making decisions that will change the course of that child's life forever, and the children are not involved in the decisions, and how they approach that later. And all of those texts have that in common, but probably most especially Peter Pan. So I think it's a good analogy, the analogy to music, to pick up what Julie said, because I spoke with Julie's book club last week and talked about my childhood in the Congo, a country which has very much in common with Sri Lanka in that it was torn apart first by Portuguese colonialists and then successive generations, the French but especially, and the very worst, the Belgians, and that the aftermath of that has been endless civil war, unrelenting civil war, in a country whose lines were perfectly arbitrarily drawn, with tribal groups who would never have put themselves in the same nationalistic context had anyone consulted them. And I think it's interesting, the bridge there is the jazz, because when I was in the Congo, I watched Africans healing themselves through music, using rhythms that had run through their tribal groups for so many hundreds of years that only the griot in the group knew roughly where the origins of those rhythms might have been. And it was an antidote. It was an answer to the suffering of colonialism. It was something that stood apart from and was separate from the white-skinned people, some of whom meant well. My parents went there to found a hospital to treat tuberculosis, but they brought with them a whole raft of assumptions about what was a viable way to live, what was a viable way to exist in the world, that didn't take into account a Congolese perspective, I think, in any way at all. Now, after 13 years there, they were better at that than they'd been when they arrived, but damage is done. Music can be a tremendous force for accommodating the trauma of that.
I would like to really congratulate both Debushree and Jean and Roma for her very perceptive insights. And I want us to leave with this very positive idea, which Debushree brought up right in the beginning of her talk about life during COVID-19 and how strategically that immediately when you're reading Running in the Family and you're thinking of the interviews about what jazz has meant during his growing up years in England, where he was totally out of country. He speaks about going to these jazz bars surreptitiously 3 times a week, and jazz, that music, is his healing. And I think now, more than ever, the world needs to know that with the mental health situation that we are all going through, music is a huge healer. And I think Ondaatje, apart from the art of collage and putting together pieces, and it always reminds me, Debushree, somehow of Salman Rushdie, and the idea of the broken mirror, which is far more strong, Jean and Roma, in the way the imagism works in the mind, the possibilities rather than just a mirror. And the mirror trope is again recurrent in Ondaatje. We see that in Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family, when the fathers Mervyn cannot face the mirror anymore. We see that in The English Patient, where Hannah can't look at a mirror anymore. She'd rather look at a reflection refracted in that water. So thank you very, very much. Roma, it's been wonderful. And Jean and Debushree, so much to talk about. Another time for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I may, for topic for another conference, is jazz as a sort of, isn't it a sort of subaltern language within a country?
It is indeed.
As is hip-hop. Aside.
Yes,
I'm
as is
putting it
hip-hop.
aside.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much again.
Thank you all.